On behalf of the entire congregation, I welcome you to the Unitarian Church of the Shenandoah Valley. I am Nancy Tickner, your worship associate for today's service. We gather together for our doubts as well as our convictions, with our fears and our hopes, with our failures and our aspirations, with our sorrows and our joys. Whether you are joining us today for the first time or you've been a member or friend for many years, we are glad you are here. Whatever faiths you have known, if any, whatever your background, whoever you are, whomever you love, however you arrived here, you are welcome. And welcome spring. Our speaker today is our UUCSV friend, Nathan Seelove, who grew up in our congregation and is the son of Shelley and Raymond Seelove. He will talk about constructing a social model of disability. Nathan is a communication professor and a longtime advocate for autism, social justice, and neurodiversity. He is a podcaster and a YouTuber and has been furthering social justice since he was a kid. He is assisted by Dad Raymond, who is a retired professor of anatomy and physiology. He is a proud father and the source of Nathan's awesome genes for autism. Now let us enter into this time of worship.
My first reading for today is a poem that I wrote when I was 19 years old. I am now 25. So there are some aspects of this poem that could potentially be dated at this point. For example, I make references to having chiseled abs. That is no longer the case. However, I also make some references to my development of self-confidence. And as you will hear from the service that I discuss, some things I discussed in the service, some of those have also changed. So this is Me Love by myself, Nathan Seelove. I'd like to introduce you all to my favorite person, me. When we fight, we can still agree. When we argue, it doesn't get too hot. When we talk, it doesn't get too cold. If I'm doing something that pisses me off, I can be like, hey, Nathan, cut that out. My body is ripped. My abs are chiseled perfectly. Shall I compare me to a summer's day? I art more lovely and more temperate. I pity those that will live their entire lives but will never be me. Because being me is a feat only I have achieved. 12 letters have never sounded so sweet. Nathan C. Love. I put the me in team. I put the C in love. I put the me in C love, as in I love me, see? If I were a vine, my fruit would be more than sweet. It would be the food everyone needs. It would cure diseases. It would create world peace. Piece it together. There's nothing but me. But a vine needs a tree. Without a tree, the vine will never reach the canopy. And as hard as I try, I cannot be my own tree. I started as the kid who was socially acceptable to call ugly. The kid who was cheered out of the room when he left early. The kid whose friend count never made it to 3, the kid that put dis in disability, the kid in the back of the room because no one wanted to see his personality that didn't fit their version of normality. If it's different, it must be met with negativity. How dare I live a life not governed by those around me? How dare I deviate from the path others have so graciously laid out for me? How dare I dabble in the dark arts of individuality? So I changed. I lied to myself. Like one does to their hair, I dyed my personality. But dye only covers up the real me, is a deceptive layer of color over who I used to be. I spent hours working on my body to create a sexy person who has something to be confident about. I put my mask on. A smiling, confident, attractive man. But every time I look in the mirror, all I see is who I was, who I am, but never who I want to be. So I'll keep lying to myself until I believe. I'd like to introduce you to my favorite person, me.
Now, as Raymond comes forward, let us all say together from our homes the words for lighting our chalice. In the light of truth and in the warmth of love, we gather to seek, to sustain, to share. And I invite you to join with me as we say our covenant. Love is the spirit of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament. To dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in freedom, and to help our neighbor. To these ends, we covenant one with another.
Please join me in a moment of silence as we hold in our hearts all of those in our nation and the world who are struggling and suffering from the challenges and losses related to the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic and educational disruptions, as well as systemic racism, injustice, and devastating weather events.
On the Other Hand by Raymond Seelove. Suppose I was left-handed. Is it easy to see that there's nothing inherently inferior about left-handedness. It's just a difference, right? No better, no worse. On the other hand, what if left-handedness is rare and I live in a society that assumes right-handedness? What if they make machines for right-handed operators? What if they write from left to right so that people who are right-handed will not smear their ink? What if I learned to write using my left hand, smearing the words? What if I used my clumsy right hand and no one could read my writing? Would I be called a low-functioning lefty? On the other hand, what if I twisted my left hand awkwardly to avoid smearing the ink? What if I managed to write just well enough that the right-handed folks could tell what I was trying to write? Would I then qualify as a high-functioning lefty? Left-handedness is not itself disabling, but the expectations of society might be disabling. Do they have to be? In this modern world of typed words on computers, what does it matter? But I am not left-handed. I'm autistic. In a world where most folks are neurotypical. It's just a difference, right? No better, no worse. Is that harder to see? What if the rules of polite behavior are made by and for the neurotypicals? What if the nature of normal relationships assumes neurotypicality? What if the definition of empathy itself amounts to this? How well do you understand neurotypical people? If with supreme effort I awkwardly pass, will I be called a high-functioning autistic? On the other hand, suppose I decide to use the strengths of the differences of my brain. Suppose I achieve great things that neurotypical brains cannot. If my society can't or won't notice, would that make me a low-functioning autistic? On the other hand, what if society could learn to accommodate my differences and utilize my strengths, just as it can do with left-handedness? Would we all be better for it?
So to start out, let me paint for you a scenario. So a person in a wheelchair goes to a restaurant and there's no ramp and they can't get in because of that. They can't lift their wheelchair onto the sidewalk in order to be able to get into the restaurant, and therefore access is barred. Now, what about another scenario? Prior to the passage of the Civil Rights Act, a person of color tries to go to a restaurant and notices a sign out front that says whites only. So, what are the similarities between these situations? Well, first off, let's look at the differences. Some of the obvious differences are the fact that the owners of the restaurant that is not accessible to the person in the wheelchair, they probably did not intend anything malicious. They probably were just ignorant of the needs of people in wheelchairs. Whereas the person with the whites only sign is probably had malicious intent. That was based on this idea of white people being inherently superior to people of color. Well, but what about the similarities? Well, one of the biggest similarities is the fact that both of these situations bar access. And this is an important concept, access. Now, there are lots of ways throughout the course of history in which discussing civil rights among people with disabilities, discussing social rights among people with disabilities, have been discussed. We refer to these as the models of disability discourse. And there are three primary models: the moral model, the medical model, and the social model. So today I want to lay out these models, discuss them. I want to talk about how they pertain to my own life as somebody who is on the autism spectrum. And I want to talk about ways in which we can embody a more social model of disability discourse. So to start out, let's talk about the moral model of disability. So the moral model of disability assumes that the place where disability comes from is some type of moral failing, right? some type of moral failing, sometimes on the part of the individual, and sometimes on the part of the society at large. So how might this translate? Well, on the really dark side of it, it could translate into parents assuming that because their kid was born with some type of deformity, that that kid must be possessed by demons, and therefore we need to go drown them in a well. That escalated quickly, but that was the assumption that has often been made throughout a lot of history. In fact, the moral model has actually been the dominant model throughout most of human history. So what about a sort of lighter side of the moral model? Well, some people might assume that the result of disability comes from some type of higher power. Namely, a higher power sees sin, sees corruption in a society, and it makes somebody disabled, number one, as a punishment for society, but number two, as a test. So the idea is that if a person with a disability is put into society, God is trying to tell you, you need to take care of this person to make up for your own sins. Now, this might be a lighter side, but in a lot of ways it is still pretty patronizing. Because again, it is assuming that the natural state of being is non-disabled. That it is unnatural to be disabled. And this has also taken some forms in modern society. A while back, there was this councilwoman in Illinois, who I believe was running for House of Representatives at one point, who basically made the argument that autistic children were God's punishment for gay people. Now, considering the fact that autistics often claim many brilliant minds among our community, such as Thomas Edison, such as Albert Einstein, such as Nikola Tesla, the gays must be doing something right. So let's move on and talk about the medical model. So the medical model of disability assumes that disability comes from a genetic lottery. So this is a move away from the moral model in that it's not trying to impose some type of intelligent order on the origin of disability. Instead, it assumes that you just were unlucky. So the primary point, the primary goal of the medical model is to try to alleviate that. Try to alleviate that medical condition, that sickness. Now, this also has a darker side and a lighter side to it. The lighter side of this is the fact that it can lead to advancements. It can lead to advancements in technology that helps people in the disabled community. It can lead to advancements in technology that accommodates those of us with disabilities. But that is when the focus of the medical model, the focus of people that follow the medical model, is on the individual and not on protecting society from the individual. Unfortunately, a darker side of the medical model is eugenics, protecting society from the individual. Now, the United States has a very dark history with regard to eugenics. Now, once we started seeing the Nazis do it, we realized, oh, that's not good. Maybe we shouldn't be like them. We were kind of the reverse hipsters of eugenics. We were doing it before it was not cool. So, in a lot of ways, you might look at the medical model as being the pinnacle of achievement. Here we are at a point where, as long as we aren't focusing on protecting society and we're focusing on the individual, then why else would we want to push any further? Well, there are a couple reasons. First off, the medical model creates what we refer to as a culture of sympathy. Now, here's what I mean by that. If a person has some type of disability, and you take a video of them overcoming that challenge, people that aren't disabled might watch that and think, oh, wow, that's so inspirational. That makes me feel so good. I can achieve anything because, look, this disabled person is achieving it. However, it doesn't take into account the societal failings that create disability. And that brings us to the social model. The social model assumes that a lot of what makes a disability disabling is simply the fact that society was not built for them. So think of it this way. If every single person in the world had a wheelchair, if every single person in the world used a wheelchair, then every restaurant would have a ramp. And in fact, not only that, people without wheelchairs, they would be considered the freak. You know, as my father alluded to in his discussion about left-handedness, if a society is built around the idea that right-handedness is the neutral, then left-handedness becomes the disability. Now, in a lot of cases, things that we might look at and objectively argue are disabling don't often factor into a person's disabled identity. For example, think about glasses. As I look around the room, there are two people in this room that do not have glasses. Myself and, never mind. I'm the only person in this room that doesn't have glasses. So, there we go. So in a world in which most people have glasses, in a world in which minor issues with eyesight are easily corrected with glasses, people that wear glasses often don't view themselves as being disabled because it's very simple to accommodate. So this is similarly to how it would work in a social, when we look at things with a social model. Also, the scenario that I discussed at the beginning of the disabled person who is unable to go into the restaurant because of the lack of wheelchair access, that is viewed as a societal failing, and that is viewed as oppression. Now, in my own life, I've kind of traveled through all three of these models. For a while, I was going through the moral model. Namely, I was thinking that the reason why I was different, the reason why I was annoying, and for those of you that taught me back when I was in religious education, I might have been fun, but let's be real, I was a pain, all right? And I do apologize for that. I promise I have grown up a little bit. But at the same time, unfortunately, when I would be in school, people would be a lot less accepting of that. And I often viewed my own shortcomings as a result of my disability, as a result of my own moral failing. If people were bullying me, if people were ostracizing me, it must be something that I'm doing. There must be something bad about me. I deserve this. Honestly, this was the only way that I could rationalize how a lot of my fellow students treated me. I alluded to in my Me Love poem a time when I was standing in a classroom and I told my class that I was not going to be attending class for the last few weeks of school. And when I did that, everyone cheered because they wouldn't have to deal with me. You know, in the moment, I tried to put on a smiley face like, oh yeah, I'm in on the joke, but I wasn't. It hurt. I was devastated on the inside. But what's interesting is this actually takes me to the next step of my journey through the models of disability, to the medical model. Because the reason why I was going to be not at school for the last few weeks was because I was going to go get a service dog. Now, many of you who know me in this church, you probably eventually came to know me as that kid with the dog. Well, things have changed a little bit. Now I'm that young man with a dog. So this started bringing me into a more medical model view. I started viewing my disability as just a simple genetic luck of the draw. And the service dog was the medical device that I was using in order to alleviate those symptoms. However, I still very much viewed it as a disability, as a curse. I didn't really see any major advantages to being autistic. In a lot of ways, I still felt ostracized, but at the same time, there were people that had previously bullied me that apologized because they realized that the reason why I acted the way I did was because I had a disability. And so that generated sympathy. And sympathy is better than antipathy. However, sympathy does not create structural change. Or at least, it doesn't go far enough in creating structural change. So, time moved on. I even embraced some other aspects of the medical model, like referring to myself as a person with autism rather than an autistic person, to try to separate the me from the disability. But as time moved on, I started to realize something. I am autistic. That is a part of who I am. That is an integral part of my personality. It's an integral part of my identity. And when people prevented access because of the service dog, when I encountered issues in which I would go to a restaurant and they would say, you can't have that dog in there, suddenly I started to realize the most disabling aspect right now is not the autism, it's the society. It's the person that doesn't understand the need for a service dog. In that moment, I realized this is not just some type of medical issue. This is not just some type of issue of this restaurant depriving me of something that is medically necessary. This is an example of societal oppression. So I started to embrace a more social model. And this is actually around the time that right after I wrote the poem that you saw me read earlier. That was back when I was still very much embracing a medical model. But now I've gotten to the point where I'm starting to realize a few things. First off, let's look at person-first language, for example. What is the difference between the phrase person with autism and autistic? Well, it's the word person. But if we need that qualifier, then we're basically making it sound as if an autistic is not a person to begin with. And that's just not the case. So when I realized that, my journey towards the social model had been completed. It is important as a society that we recognize that when disability is not accommodated, that is not just a problem with medicine. It's an oppressive problem. It's a societal barrier. So, what are some ways in which we can potentially incorporate a social model of disability into our own lives? Well, the first one is to recognize intersectionality. Now, think about the example that I gave earlier in this speech. The example of the person of color encountering a whites only sign, and the person in a wheelchair encountering a restaurant in which there was no wheelchair. There was no wheelchair access. Think about that example. You probably immediately assumed that those were two different people. And the way I framed them, it sounded like they were. But what if they weren't? What if a person of color was in a wheelchair going to a restaurant that had no wheelchair access and also had a whites only sign? What if this happened in modern day, after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act and after the passage of the Civil Rights Act? Well, naturally this person would complain to the Justice Department, would complain to the Civil Rights Division. However, currently there is no link between the Civil Rights Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Therefore, intersectional discrimination is not taken into account. So that person would have to file two different reports. Another way in which we can try to incorporate the social model into our own lives. Don't assume that normalcy is the goal. Now, one of the ways in which I've embraced a social model of autism is to recognize that I wouldn't be me without it. So the idea that a cure is number one, achievable, but number two, desirable, to me, is kind of insulting. Because a cure for autism would be a change in my personality, would be a change in who I am as a person. And a lot of people within the disabled community feel this way about a number of different disabilities. Not all, but many. So don't automatically assume that the primary goal of disability activism is achieving complete normalcy. Number three, try to respect people's own way of identifying themselves. Now, a lot of people within the autism community prefer what we refer to as identity first language. As I alluded to earlier, I don't necessarily need the qualifier of person with autism in order to feel like I'm being, my dignity as a human being is being acknowledged. However, not everybody feels that way. So here's what you should do. Wait to hear how the person identifies themselves. Do they identify themselves as a person who is disabled, as a disabled, or as autistic, as a person with autism? And then respect the way that they choose to identify themselves. Number 4, understand that allyship is a practice, not an identity. So what I mean by that is when I advocate for autism issues, that's not just some mask that I'm putting on. I wake up autistic, I advocate while autistic, and I go to sleep autistic. And as important as allies are in the movement, it is important to recognize that people that are not disabled, they wake up not disabled, and they go to sleep not disabled. And so allyship is a practice, not an identity. And finally, number 5. This can be summed up with one simple phrase. Nothing about us without us. There are lots of disability organizations, and I want to specifically focus on autism organizations, in which the primary function appears to not be to reinforce the voices of people within that community, but rather to assume that they know what's best for that community. A good example of this is the organization Autism Speaks. Autism Speaks has a board of directors with 2 autistics on it, out of like 25 people. That's about us without us. So organizations that are not represented by disabled people, that aren't primarily driven by disabled people, those should not be the organizations that you reinforce. If you are looking to reinforce and to support organizations within the autism community that are about us, with us, I would look at the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. As a society, it is our moral imperative to build a social model. It is our moral imperative to amplify the voices of those of us in the disabled community. And plenty of studies have shown that that is the major driver of civil rights. That if you do embrace a social model, you are more likely to advocate for true reform, truly helpful reform for the disabled community. So on behalf of the disabled community, I welcome you to embrace this social model of disability.
The hymn you just heard, number 302, Children of the Human Race, from the Gray Hymnal. It's one that Nathan and I chose because one of the most common similes that people with autism use to describe our experience is that it's like being from another planet. In science fiction, we have lots of characters that represent this, from Mr. Spock to the man who fell to Earth. And so, thinking of it that way, these words really appealed to us. Children of the human race, offspring of our Mother Earth, not alone in endless space has our planet given birth. Far across the cosmic skies, countless suns in glory blaze, and from untold planets rise endless canticles of praise. Should some sign of others reach this, our lonely planet Earth, differences of form and speech must not hide our common worth. When at length our minds are free and the clouds of fear disperse, then at last we'll learn to be children of the universe.
On behalf of the entire congregation, I'd like to extend our deepest appreciation and thanks for a beautiful service put together by Nathan and Raymond Seelove. As Raymond extinguishes the flame, let us say together from our homes the words for extinguishing our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of our community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we meet again. The purpose of the church is to encourage all who gather to grow more generous in spirit and in action. We hope that you will consider making an offering after today's service through our webpage, uushenandoah.org, which allows us to exercise the generosity of spirit for this self-supporting church and its many ministries which continue when we are not able to physically be able to be together. And we invite you to join our church community at noon for our virtual post-service gathering for joys and concerns, followed by our coffee hour conversations in smaller breakout groups. The Zoom link is found in your UUCSV email. And thank you so much for joining us today.
My name's Dixie Wiles, and I've been a member of this church since 1992. And I want to tell you about what I love about this church and what I look forward to this coming year and beyond. I really miss being in our church, and because the community that's here has been my life support through my life and through the life that I've been here. Anyway, so I miss the community of everyone being gathered together. I'm thankful that we have the recordings, and that's been really helpful. I also want to encourage people to support the church financially, because that's how we got here. When I started my membership, we were in an old church right next door, and it was a small group, and we did a lot of work, and we were able to raise the funds to build this beautiful sanctuary. And what we need now is the money and the support of everybody to keep things going. And I also want to say that I'm really impressed by the volunteer work that goes on here. You all kick in and do so much work. So I am happy to be part of this community. I've been thrilled to watch it grow. And if you just watch Nathan Seelove's service, Leslie and I taught him when he was a young man, and to watch him become who he is today, and the other ones that we taught, is really a joy. So and we've raised our own kids in this church as well. So I'm just grateful to be here, and I hope you'll continue to support in any way you can, both financially and through volunteer, and just coming to service. And when we open the doors, it'll be a great day. Thanks.